There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their heads. It involves mud and poetry, sacrifice and tragedy, young men in photographs who look somehow both ancient and impossibly young. It involves poppies and silence and names carved into stone. That version is real, but it is only a surface. Beneath it, there is another war entirely. One that the governments who ran it never fully wanted you to understand. One that the men who survived it rarely found the words to describe. And one that the institutions managing it preferred to bury under mountains of official language and bureaucratic process. That war was not about tragedy. It was about routine. It was about the steady, mechanical conversion of human beings into operational units, and then into casualties, and then into numbers, and then into nothing at all. What happened between 1914 and 1918 was not simply a catastrophe. It was a system. And once you understand how that system worked, the habits it produced, the behaviors it normalized, the realities it forced millions of men to accept as ordinary, you begin to understand something genuinely disturbing about what industrial civilization is capable of when it decides that the cost of human life is an acceptable line item in a ledger. The men who fought in World War I did things that no one today would recognize as normal. They developed habits, rituals, tolerances, and adaptations that were, by any standard outside the trenches, evidence of extreme psychological damage operating under extreme physical conditions. But inside the war, these things were not considered damage. They were considered adjustment. They were considered the natural response of a soldier doing his job. The machinery of the war required men to become something other than what they had been before the war, and in most cases, the war was very good at making that happen. Begin with the most immediate reality of trench life, which is the smell. People today live in a world of such aggressive sanitation that the sensory reality of the Western Front has become almost impossible to reconstruct mentally. But the men who arrived in France and Flanders for the first time consistently reported that they smelled the trenches before they saw them. The odor was composed of many things. It included the smell of unwashed human bodies that had not been properly cleaned in weeks or months. It included the smell of wet wool, which becomes a particular kind of suffocating when worn continuously and soaked through repeatedly. It included the smell of the latrines, which in many sections of the front were nothing more than cut-down barrels or holes dug into the trench wall, impossible to properly cover, visited at intervals that were sometimes forced by incoming fire to become irregular or abandoned entirely. It included the smell of chloride of lime, which was spread in trenches as a disinfectant and which became so associated with the front that men described it years later as the defining scent of the war. And it included, above all, the smell of decomposition. The dead did not go away. This is perhaps the single most important physical fact of the Western Front that modern people have the most difficulty absorbing. In conventional understanding, when someone dies in a war, they are buried. But on the Western Front, burial was frequently impossible, and when it was possible, it was often temporary. The landscape between the opposing trenches, the territory called no man's land, was a zone of continuous fire from both sides. A man killed in that space could not be retrieved. He simply remained there. He remained there for days, and then for weeks, and then sometimes for months. The men in the trenches on both sides could see the bodies, or what remained of them, when they looked over the parapet. They became part of the landscape. Some sections of the front had bodies that had been there so long they had been partially absorbed into the mud, visible only as a boot, or a hand, or a fragment of uniform. And not only in no man's land. Trench walls themselves sometimes revealed the dead. When new sections were dug, or when old sections collapsed, bodies from previous engagements appeared. Men routinely dug in areas where the ground contained remains from earlier fighting. The physical structure of the front lines was, in many places, built upon and among the dead. Soldiers normalized this. They had to. There was no alternative. A man who could not tolerate the proximity of decomposing human remains could not function in that environment. And a man who could not function could not be used. And the war required men who could be used. So they adjusted. They joked about it. They gave names to particularly prominent bodies in no man's land. They used remains as landmarks. They described the smell in flat, practical terms in their diaries and letters, the same way they described the weather or the quality of the rations. The habit of treating the dead as furniture was not a sign of callousness so much as it was a sign of adaptation. But it was an adaptation that would have been recognized in any other context as a profound and troubling departure from what human beings ordinarily do with their dead. The relationship with rats deserves its own extended consideration, because it represents one of the more complete examples of how the war forced men to renegotiate their relationship with the natural world. The trenches produced rats in numbers that are difficult to imagine. The combination of food waste, human remains, standing water, and confined spaces created ideal conditions for rat populations of extraordinary density. Men described seeing rats the size of cats. They described being woken by rats running across their faces as they tried to sleep. They described watching rats feed on the bodies of the dead in no man's land, visible through periscopes or in the early morning light. They described finding their rations gnawed through, their equipment chewed, their personal belongings scattered and damaged. Rats were not an occasional nuisance. They were a permanent feature of the environment, as constant as the mud or the cold. And so men developed a relationship with them that was, from a peacetime perspective, bizarre. Rat hunting became a recreational activity, pursued with the same earnestness that a man might bring to a sport. Soldiers organized rat hunts. They used terriers when they could get them. They used bayonets, spades, clubs improvised from whatever materials were at hand. They competed over kill counts. Some men kept tallies. There was humor in it, because humor was one of the tools men used to maintain psychological function in conditions that would otherwise have been intolerable. But there was also something else in it. A genuine, focused aggression directed at the only available target that could be attacked without coordinated military action, without orders, without preparation. Killing rats was one of the few autonomous acts of violence available to a man who otherwise existed in a state of almost total institutional control. The rat hunting was also, however, punctuated by a stranger behavior. Some men fed the rats. Some men named them. Some men, particularly in the long stretches of routine trench duty between active engagements, developed something that could be described as companionship with specific animals who returned to the same areas regularly. The psychology of this is not difficult to understand. The rats were alive. In an environment saturated with death and mechanized destruction, a living creature with recognizable behavioral patterns, one that came back, one that could be reliably found, one that responded predictably to the presence of food, represented something that the men around you might not be alive to represent tomorrow. The management of lice was so thoroughly normalized in the trenches that it had its own vocabulary, its own routines, and its own social dimension. The body louse, which thrived in the seams of clothing and in the fabric of uniforms, was present on virtually every man on the Western Front within weeks of his arrival. There was no effective way to eliminate them given the conditions. Men could not wash their clothes regularly. They could not change into clean clothing with any frequency. The laundry systems that existed behind the lines were insufficient for the scale of the problem, and the men in the forward trenches spent extended periods without access to them at all. So the lice were simply there, all the time, feeding, breeding, producing the crawling sensation that men described as one of the most persistently maddening aspects of trench life. The response was practical. Men developed the habit of delousing themselves and each other during any available quiet period, running thumbnails along the seams of their shirts, cracking the lice and their eggs between their fingernails, holding the clothing over a candle flame to kill what could be killed that way. This activity, called chatting in British slang, became a social ritual. Men sat together doing it. They talked while they did it. It was one of the activities that filled the enormous stretches of time in the trenches when nothing was actively happening. But it was also entirely futile as a solution because the lice always returned. And everyone knew this, and men did it anyway, because doing something about an uncontrollable problem, even something that produced only temporary and incomplete relief, was better than doing nothing. The alternative was to sit with the sensation without responding to it, and that was harder. Trench foot was not an accident. It was a predictable consequence of the physical environment, and the fact that it became one of the most widespread medical conditions of the war is an indictment of the institutional response to a known and manageable problem. The condition developed when feet were kept wet and cold for extended periods without adequate circulation, which is an exact description of what happened to virtually every man who stood watch in a flooded trench. The feet began to swell, and then to lose sensation, and in serious cases the tissue died, and in the most extreme cases men lost their feet, or their legs below the knee, to a condition that had no military glamour whatsoever, that was not caused by the enemy, that was not a wound in any heroic sense, but that was the direct consequence of being kept standing in water, because the organizational and logistical system managing the war could not or would not rotate men through their positions quickly enough to prevent it. The treatment required dry socks and the opportunity to dry the feet, which were not reliably available. Men were instructed to rub whale oil into their feet, which helped somewhat. Officers were made responsible for inspecting their men's feet, which produced the extraordinary daily ritual of soldiers presenting their feet for examination by their superiors, a domestic intimacy entirely alien to any prior military tradition, conducted as standard procedure alongside weapons inspections and roll calls. The men who got trench foot badly enough were evacuated to medical facilities behind the lines. In the early period of the war, before the condition was fully understood at the institutional level, some men were disciplined for it, on the theory that it represented a failure of personal hygiene or a deliberate attempt to acquire a condition that would remove them from the front. The idea that a man would deliberately allow his feet to rot in order to escape the trenches was not, given the conditions, entirely irrational from a command perspective, and this fact alone tells you something about what the conditions were. The relationship between soldiers and alcohol in World War I was not incidental. It was systematic. The British Army issued rum rations to frontline soldiers, typically in the morning before an assault or during particularly harsh conditions. The rum was issued from large ceramic jugs marked with the letters SRD, which officially stood for Supply Reserve Depot, but which men universally interpreted as standing room doubt or service rum diluted or any number of other sardonic alternatives. The rum ration was not a generous amount. It was approximately 2 ounces, issued in a mess tin lid or similar improvised vessel, consumed immediately under the supervision of an officer or non-commissioned officer to prevent hoarding. But it was consistent, and it was anticipated, and for many men it was one of the reliable anchor points in a day that otherwise offered very little reliability. The French army had their Pinard, a rough red wine issued in similar fashion. The German army had schnapps and beer available through their canteen systems. All of the major armies recognized, in their different institutional ways, that men in the conditions of the Western Front required chemical assistance to maintain what was classified as military effectiveness. The unofficial drinking went considerably beyond the official ration. Men who could acquire additional alcohol did so through a variety of channels. Officers had mess facilities with somewhat more flexible access to spirits. Estaminets, the small cafes and bars in the towns and villages behind the lines, were destinations during any period of rest. Local populations produced and sold additional quantities of alcohol to soldiers with money to spend, and the relationship between drinking and psychological management was clear to anyone paying attention, including the command structure, which managed it through the official ration system rather than attempting suppression, because suppression would have been both impossible and counterproductive. Men who were going to be asked to walk into machine gun fire in the morning needed something to occupy the night before, and the institution knew this and provided for it. The trench raid was an activity so thoroughly detached from any strategic purpose that its persistence throughout the war represents one of the clearest examples of institutional logic operating independently of human cost. A trench raid was a small unit attack, typically conducted at night, involving anywhere from a handful to a few dozen men, directed at a section of the enemy's front-line trench. The stated purposes varied: intelligence gathering, capturing prisoners for interrogation, destroying enemy positions, demonstrating offensive spirit. But the honest assessment of many officers and historians is that trench raids persisted primarily because high command required units to demonstrate activity, and a raid was the most visible form of activity available to a frontline unit in a period of static warfare. The men who conducted raids developed a distinct set of practices, tools, and habits. Because rifles were unwieldy in confined trench spaces, and because firearms made noise that eliminated the element of surprise, raiders were frequently equipped with improvised close combat weapons, clubs made from entrenching tool handles with metal heads attached, knives, brass knuckles, sharpened spades. The reappearance of medieval hand-to-hand weapons in a war defined by industrial technology was not incidental. It was functional. The trench raid required men to enter a confined space and kill the people in it as quickly and quietly as possible. The men who became skilled at this, who were selected repeatedly for raiding parties because of their apparent facility with close-range killing, were considered assets. Their skill was noted and utilized. The psychological cost of developing that skill was not systematically considered. The men came back from raids, and they were debriefed, and they rested, and they went out again. Superstition in the trenches reached a density and specificity that would have been considered extreme even by the standards of previous centuries. Men who lived in conditions of genuine and continuous mortal uncertainty developed elaborate systems of protective belief that had no official sanction and no rational basis, but that served the psychological function of imposing a sense of agency on a situation that offered almost none. Specific objects were considered lucky: a particular coin, a photograph carried in a certain pocket, a rabbit's foot purchased in a town behind the lines. Specific behaviors were considered dangerous. 3 men sharing a match was widely believed to be fatal because the light would be visible long enough for a sniper to aim and fire. This belief was specific enough and widespread enough that it became embedded in post-war civilian culture and persisted for decades afterward. The specific origin of this belief is unclear. Some accounts attribute it to the South African War, others to earlier conflicts. What is clear is that in the trenches it was observed with the seriousness of a standing order. Men who did not believe it personally still often complied, because the social cost of violating a shared protective belief in a small unit under stress was not worth bearing. The same was true for walking under ladders, crossing paths with black cats, and dozens of other traditional omens, which were taken far more seriously under fire than they would ever be taken in a civilian context. New superstitions were generated continuously. If a man survived something that should have killed him, other men noted the details of what he had done differently and adjusted their own behavior accordingly. Not because any causal logic supported it, but because in an environment where causation was opaque and death was random, any pattern that could be found was better than no pattern at all. The mind, faced with conditions it cannot control and cannot comprehend, builds architecture from whatever materials are available. In the trenches, the available materials included shared fear, proximity, and an acute awareness that the man next to you was alive right now and might not be alive tomorrow, and that the difference between those two states was not, as far as anyone could determine, a matter of merit or preparation or caution or anything that could be reliably reproduced. The practice of collecting souvenirs from the dead, both enemy and in some cases one's own, was common enough that it generated official prohibitions that were widely ignored. Men took buttons, badges, belt buckles, identification documents, photographs, personal letters, weapons, and in the most disturbing cases, pieces of the bodies themselves. The taking of teeth was reported, ears, fingers. These were not isolated incidents attributable to individual pathology. They were widespread enough to appear in official records, in letters home that were censored, but still passed by censors presumably too overwhelmed by volume to address every violation of expected norms, and in the personal accounts of men who witnessed or participated in the practice and described it with a matter-of-factness that reveals how thoroughly normalized it had become. The psychological mechanism involved is not simple. Some of it was trophy-taking in the most literal anthropological sense, the acquisition of physical proof of having killed, which served a function in a war where individual killing was often indirect, impersonal, or impossible to confirm. Some of it was the byproduct of a general loosening of the behavioral constraints that normally govern human interaction with bodies. Some of it was economic, since German equipment in particular was considered superior to British issue in certain respects and was worth acquiring. Some of it was something harder to name, a need to make tangible contact with the reality of what was happening, to hold something physical in the hand that connected the abstract industrialized killing to a specific concrete human moment. Whatever the mixture of causes, the behavior was common, and it was visible, and it was managed by the institution primarily through the occasional threat of disciplinary action that was rarely actually carried out, because the number of men engaged in the practice was too large to prosecute meaningfully, and because the command structure had more pressing concerns than the souvenir collections of frontline soldiers. The informal truces that occurred along the Western Front, of which the Christmas Truce of 1914 is the most famous, but which continued to occur in various forms throughout the war, reveal something important about the gap between the institutional reality of the war and the human reality of the men conducting it. The Christmas Truce has been sentimentalized beyond recognition in the century since it occurred. The version most people know involves football and carols and the universal brotherhood of man briefly reasserting itself against the machinery of war. The reality was more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. The truces, including the one in December 1914 and the smaller, quieter ones that occurred in various sections of the front throughout subsequent years, were practical arrangements. They allowed both sides to collect and bury their dead. They allowed men to repair sections of trench that had been damaged. They allowed a few hours of relief from the continuous psychological pressure of potential death. But the high commands of all involved nations took a dim view of them, and as the war progressed, the informal truces were actively suppressed. Officers who permitted them faced disciplinary action. Units that had established local understandings with the troops opposite them were rotated out and replaced. The institution recognized, correctly from its own operational standpoint, that any sustained contact between opposing troops that produced mutual recognition of shared humanity was counterproductive to the project of getting those troops to kill each other efficiently. So the truces became rarer. The informal agreements, the unspoken understandings, the nods of recognition did not disappear entirely because they served immediate human needs that the institution could not fully override, but they were managed, suppressed, and eventually minimized to the point of irrelevance. The lesson, if there is one, is not that the institution failed to extinguish human feeling, but that the institution was very effective at managing human feeling in ways that served its operational requirements. Shell shock, which is now understood to be a form of combat-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, but which in the First World War was treated as something between a medical mystery, a disciplinary problem, and a sign of individual weakness, affected somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 British soldiers over the course of the war, with comparable numbers in the other major armies. The symptoms varied. Some men went mute. Some developed tremors that would not stop. Some lost the ability to walk, or to see, or to hear, despite having no physical injury that explained the loss. Some became entirely unable to function in any recognizable way, unable to dress themselves, unable to carry out simple instructions, lost in a private interior state that was visible from the outside only as a kind of blankness or withdrawal. Some became violently disruptive, some simply sat and wept without stopping. The medical and institutional response to this was, by modern standards, a combination of the inadequate and the actively harmful. Some men were treated with genuine care and insight by physicians who understood, or were beginning to understand, that the condition had a psychological rather than a neurological basis, and that it required treatment that addressed the psychological experience of the soldier. The work of men like W.H.R. Rivers, whose treatment of Siegfried Sassoon at Craiglockhart Hospital has become one of the defining accounts of the period, represents the most humane end of the institutional response. But the most humane end was not the most common end. Common responses included the label of cowardice, which carried with it a range of consequences from social humiliation to formal court-martial. They included the practice of rapid forward treatment, which aimed to return men to the front as quickly as possible on the theory that prolonged removal from the combat environment would deepen the psychological damage, a theory that had some genuine medical support, but that was also strikingly convenient for an institution that needed the bodies back. They included electroshock treatments that were not therapeutic in any recognizable sense, but were applied on the theory that discomfort and the threat of pain might motivate a return to function. They included executions. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war for offences that included desertion, cowardice, and striking a superior officer. The number of those men who were, by any reasonable modern assessment, suffering from what we would now call combat-related psychiatric illness is impossible to determine precisely, but the evidence in individual cases is often substantial. These men were taken out and shot by firing squads composed of their fellow soldiers, a task that itself produced lasting psychological damage in the men required to perform it. And then the execution was recorded, and the record was filed, and the institution moved on. The censorship of letters home was so thoroughly routinized that it became simply another administrative feature of military life, accepted without particular comment by the men whose correspondence was being read and edited. Officers were responsible for reading the outgoing letters of the men under their command and removing any content that might provide information of military value to the enemy, or that might, and this is the more revealing category, depress civilian morale. The letters that passed through censorship were therefore not representative of the full range of what men were experiencing and thinking. They were a selected, edited version, shaped by the awareness of the soldier writing them that his words would be read before they reached their destination. Some men wrote in private codes that their families understood. Some men simply did not write about the things they most wanted to say. Some men wrote letters that were entirely conventional, that described the weather and the food and the small social details of life behind the lines, and said nothing at all about the violence and the fear and the proximity of death, because there were no words for those things that would pass the censor, and because they did not want to frighten the people they had left behind. The letters that survive are therefore a kind of archive of silence, full of the shape of everything that was not said. And the families at home reading those letters constructed their understanding of the war from that selected and sanitized material, and the gap between the war the families understood and the war the men were living was enormous, and that gap persisted after the men came home. And it was one of the primary reasons why so many veterans of the First World War found it impossible to talk about what they had experienced. They had already learned during the war that the true experience could not be transmitted to those who had not shared it. The censorship had taught them that. The fragging of officers, meaning the killing of one's own commanding officer by the men under his command, is not a phenomenon that is extensively documented in World War I histories, but it happened. The evidence is fragmentary and often circumstantial, because the circumstances of combat provided ample opportunity for a death to occur that no one would investigate closely. But the accounts that do exist, in diaries, in unit histories, in the recollections of veterans, make clear that men did occasionally exercise lethal judgment on officers whose decisions were viewed as incompetent, reckless, or simply homicidal in their indifference to the lives of the men they commanded. The line between this and ordinary combat death was sometimes not a line at all, but a range of possibility that no one had an institutional interest in resolving. An officer leading an attack who was shot from behind could have been shot by the enemy. The battlefield offered no reliable forensic mechanism for distinguishing the two. What the accounts make clear is that men were aware of this, that it was discussed, and that it operated as a form of informal constraint on the most extreme officer behavior. The official mechanism for addressing officer incompetence was the chain of command, which was slow, cumbersome, and in many cases entirely ineffective. The unofficial mechanism was the one that the institution could neither acknowledge nor prevent, and it existed in the space between what could be proven and what everyone understood to be true. The experience of waiting, the sheer volume of empty, anxious time that composed the majority of any given soldier's experience of the war, produced habits of mind and behavior that were genuinely strange. The Western Front was not continuous action. The continuous action is the version that exists in popular imagination, but the daily reality for most men in the trenches for most of the war was boredom of an acute and specific kind. A boredom that was always undercut by the knowledge that the boredom could end at any moment in the most violent way possible. This combination, the emptiness of the present moment and the potential violence of any future moment, produced a psychological state that had no peacetime analogue and for which no term existed until long after the war ended. Men filled the time in whatever ways were available. They read when reading material could be obtained. They wrote letters. They gambled, extensively and persistently, because gambling imposed a structure of risk and outcome on time that had no other structure, and because the small-scale management of chance was one way of exercising a sense of agency, when large-scale agency had been entirely removed. They played cards. They told stories. They slept whenever sleep was possible, which was often, not very often, because the front was noisiest at night, and the night was when raids were conducted, and the night was when the organizational logic of the war required them to be most vigilant. Sleep deprivation was therefore endemic at the front, and its effects accumulated over weeks and months into a generalized cognitive impairment that was treated as a normal state of being. Men who described their mental state to medical personnel were often told they were tired and sent back to the line. The medical triage system that operated at the front, which sorted casualties by the probability of their recovery into categories that determined how much treatment they would receive, was a rational response to the conditions it faced, but it produced outcomes that would be unacceptable in any peacetime medical context. The system divided casualties into three broad categories: those who would likely recover with treatment and be returned to duty, those who were too badly wounded to be worth treating given the resources available, who were made as comfortable as possible and left to die, and those in between, who required immediate treatment to survive. The men in the second category, the expectant cases, as the bureaucratic language classified them, were not abandoned in any cruel or malicious sense. They were often given morphine and placed somewhere relatively sheltered, but they were not given the surgical attention that might, in a different context, have saved them, because the system had calculated that the available medical resources produced more utility when directed elsewhere. The men sorting casualties made these decisions quickly, under pressure, in conditions of chaos and noise and continuous incoming wounded. The decisions were made by trained professionals doing the best they could. The outcome was that men who could be saved were sometimes not saved because the system had decided that saving them was not the most efficient use of available capacity. This was not a failure of the system. It was the system working as designed, and the men who worked within it, who made those calls and then went back to making more calls, and who did this day after day through the great offensives that produced thousands of casualties in a single morning, carried those decisions with them in ways that the institution did not formally acknowledge and did not systematically treat. Gas attacks produced one of the most specific and lasting forms of fear in the entire war, and the habits of response to the threat of gas reveal clearly how the body and the mind adapt to conditions that evolution did not prepare them for. The introduction of chlorine gas at 2nd Ypres in April 1915 was followed by mustard gas in 1917. And the development of gas warfare proceeded in parallel with the development of countermeasures, with each new agent requiring a new response, and the response always lagging behind the threat. The gas mask, in its various iterations, was one of the most universally hated pieces of equipment in the British Army. It was hot, it was suffocating, it restricted vision, and wearing it for any extended period produced its own form of discomfort that was difficult to sustain under combat conditions. But the alternative was the gas itself, and the effects of the gas were well known and were communicated through direct observation and through the accounts of men who had been caught in attacks. Chlorine filled the lungs with fluid. Men drowned standing up. Phosgene worked more slowly, but killed more effectively. Mustard gas was different from all of the others in that it was not primarily intended to kill. It was intended to incapacitate, to produce casualties who required medical attention and removed men from the line without necessarily killing them, which was in some respects more effective as a weapon than killing, because wounded men were a drain on resources in a way that dead men were not. Mustard gas caused blistering of the skin, of the eyes, of the mucous membranes. Men who were exposed to it and did not receive immediate treatment lost their vision. Men who were exposed in high concentrations lost their eyesight permanently. Men who survived gas attacks continued to exist in a state of acute anxiety about gas that produced distinctive behavioral patterns. The distinctive hollow sound of the gas alarm, a shell casing hung on wire and struck repeatedly, produced immediate and reflexive responses in men who had been conditioned to it. Former soldiers reported for years after the war that certain sounds, certain smells, certain atmospheric conditions could produce the same response involuntarily. The reaction was not psychological weakness. It was the nervous system doing exactly what it had been trained to do by the conditions of the front. The system for managing dead soldiers, from the point of death to the point of official notification and beyond, was bureaucratically complex, in a way that reveals how thoroughly the institutions of the war had adapted to dealing with death on an industrial scale. When a man died, in theory, his identity disc, the metal or fiber tag worn around the neck, would be used to identify him, and his death would be recorded. A notification would be sent to his next of kin. His personal belongings would be returned. A grave would be marked. In practice, none of these things happened with anything like the reliability the theory suggested. Men died in conditions where identification was impossible. Bodies were destroyed by artillery to the point where no identification was possible. In major offensives, the dead accumulated faster than the recording systems could process them. Families received notifications months after the death. Some families never received any official notification and spent years waiting for a man who was not coming back. The graves registration units, which were responsible for locating, identifying and marking graves, were working in conditions of extreme difficulty with inadequate resources against an impossible volume of deaths. The records they maintained were incomplete. The graves they marked were often subsequently destroyed by further shelling. The identification of the dead was more aspiration than achievement. The Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, which bears the names of 72,000 British and South African men who died in the Somme sector and have no known grave, is not a monument to sacrifice in any meaningful sense. It is a monument to the administrative failure to account for the dead. It is a record of absence. The names are there because the bodies are not. The experience of returning from leave, when a man who had been at the front for an extended period was given a brief period of time in England or in a rest area before being sent back, produced one of the most clearly documented and least officially acknowledged forms of psychological suffering in the war. Men on leave frequently reported an inability to behave normally in civilian spaces. They could not sleep in beds, having been conditioned to sleep in positions and on surfaces that did not include beds. They could not eat regular meals without difficulty. They could not tolerate noise that was not combat noise. They could not have ordinary conversations about ordinary things because the gap between the reality they had been living and the reality of the home environment was too large to bridge in the time available. They found that they could not explain to their families, their friends, the people they had most wanted to see, anything real about what they had been doing. The words were not there, or the words that existed produced reactions in the listener that the soldier could not manage. The civilian world had continued during the war, and it was not the same as the soldier remembered it, and the soldier was not the same as the civilian remembered him. Men returned from leave and reported relief at being back at the front, not because the front was better, but because at least it was comprehensible. The front made a kind of sense that the home front no longer made. This was not glorification of combat. It was the recognition that a man who has been thoroughly conditioned to one environment has difficulty functioning in another, and that the conditioning the war produced was thorough enough to make the original environment feel foreign. The system of military justice that operated in the British Army during World War I was neither designed for the conditions it faced, nor adequate to them. The Field General Court-Martial was the primary mechanism by which soldiers were tried for military offenses, and it operated under constraints of speed and secrecy that produced outcomes that would be grotesque in any peacetime legal context. A man could be tried, convicted, and executed within a very short time frame. The reviewing process that existed in theory was compressed by the demands of military operations in practice. Officers who reviewed sentences were aware that the purpose of executions was not simply punitive, but exemplary, intended to demonstrate to the men in the unit what the consequences of the prohibited behavior were, and this awareness shaped their reviews in ways that the formal record does not fully capture. The men who were shot, often by firing parties composed of men from their own units, were typically given a brief interval between sentence and execution, sometimes measured in hours. The men in the firing party were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were detailed for the task. Some of them missed deliberately, some of them did not. The range of human responses to the task of executing a man you know is broad, and the institutional response to those human responses was primarily silence. The institution did not provide for the psychological consequences of having been required to shoot a comrade. It provided for the recording of the execution, for the notification of relevant parties, for the movement of the unit back to its operational position. The rest was left to the individual. The informal hierarchies that existed within units, parallel to, and sometimes at odds with, the official hierarchy of rank, produced a set of social habits and customs that were entirely invisible to the official record, but that governed much of daily life in the trenches. Old soldiers, men who had been at the front for extended periods and had survived, held a social authority that was independent of their rank. A private who had been in the trenches since 1914 and was still alive in 1917 had a credibility that a newly arrived second lieutenant could not match, regardless of his social class or his education, and both men knew it. The systems of informal authority that emerged from this reality were complex and varied by unit. In some units, the old soldiers mentored the new arrivals with genuine care. In others, the relationship was exploitative, with experienced men finding ways to direct the most dangerous tasks toward the newest and least able to resist. In all units, the old soldiers possessed knowledge that was genuinely vital, knowledge of local conditions, of where the snipers worked, of which sections of parapet were reliably covered and which were not, of how to read the sounds of incoming shells, to know whether to stay still or to move, of the 100 small operational details that no training could provide and that could, in the most literal sense, make the difference between living and dying. This knowledge was transmitted informally through conversation and observation and imitation, and the transmission was not guaranteed. Men who held it died. New men arrived and had to learn the same things again, sometimes at the cost of learning them the hard way. The relationship between soldiers and the medical system behind the lines was shaped by an awareness on the part of the soldiers that the medical system's purpose, from the institutional perspective, was not simply to heal them, but to return them to the line. The distinction between these two objectives was significant. A man who was healed was not necessarily a man who was functional enough to be returned to combat. A man who was returned to the line was not necessarily a man who had been healed. The medical system operated under pressure from above to minimize the time between injury and return to duty, and this pressure shaped every aspect of care. from the speed of evacuation through the thoroughness of treatment to the standards for fitness to return. Men who were aware of this, and most men were, navigated the medical system in ways that served their own interests, which sometimes coincided with the institution's interests and sometimes did not. Self-inflicted wounds, a category that was tracked and that carried serious disciplinary consequences, represented the most extreme end of this navigation. Men who had concluded that a wound, even a wound they inflicted on themselves, was preferable to continued exposure to combat. The prevalence was difficult to determine, precisely because many genuine wounds were indistinguishable from self-inflicted ones, and because both the men, and in some cases, their immediate officers, had reasons not to pursue the question too closely. What is clear is that the category existed, that it was significant enough to be tracked at the institutional level, and that its existence reflects the state of a man who has concluded that damage to himself is a more acceptable outcome than what the institution has planned for him. The way in which men talked about their own deaths, when they talked about them at all, developed into a set of conventions and indirections that served the psychological purpose of acknowledging a reality that could not be directly confronted without becoming paralyzed by it. The language men used was flat and practical. They talked about going west, about stopping one, about being sent up. The euphemisms were not evasions exactly. They were adaptations of language to conditions in which direct speech about the subject would have been either intolerable or offensive. A man who said directly every morning when he stood to that he might be dead before nightfall was saying something true. The truth was something everyone already knew. Saying it directly produced reactions in the people around you, reactions you then had to manage, and the management of other people's fear and grief was not something anyone had the capacity for in that environment. So the indirection served a social function. It acknowledged the reality while preserving the functional fiction that things were manageable, that tomorrow was a reasonable concept, that plans could be made. Men wrote wills that they carried in their breast pockets. Men left instructions for what should happen to their personal belongings. Men wrote letters that they gave to friends to be posted only in the event of their death. These were practical preparations. They were also a form of engagement with the probability of death that was accepted as ordinary, unremarkable, something that a sensible man did and then set aside and did not dwell on, because dwelling on it was not compatible with continued function. The animals of the war, beyond the rats, occupied a complex and revealing position in the emotional landscape of the front. Horses died in enormous numbers, approximately 8 million over the course of the war by some estimates, from artillery, from exhaustion, from disease, from the mud that swallowed them as surely as it swallowed men. The death of horses affected many soldiers in ways that the death of men did not, or did not in the same immediate way, because the responses that were officially required of men in relation to the deaths of other men, the carrying on, the continuing to function, the administrative processing of the casualty, were not required in relation to horses, and something that could not be expressed in one context found expression in another. Dogs were kept in the trenches and in rear areas as mascots, as ratters and as companions, and the relationships between men and their dogs were sometimes the most consistently nurturing relationships available in that environment. The loss of a mascot dog was grieved in ways that were not officially sanctioned, but that were also not officially prohibited, because the institution understood that the grief had nowhere else to go, and that suppressing it entirely would serve no useful purpose. Pigeons were used extensively for communication because they were more reliable than the wire communications that were constantly being cut by shelling, and the men who handled them developed relationships with them that were as peculiar and as genuine as any of the other relationships the war produced. There are accounts of men risking their lives to retrieve wounded carrier pigeons. There are accounts of pigeons that delivered their messages after being severely injured, after losing eyes, after arriving at their destinations with blood-soaked feathers from wounds that should have prevented them from flying at all. These animals were written about with a specificity and an evident emotion that is sometimes more direct than anything in the same letters about the men who had been killed beside the writer. The rotation of units through the front line, rest areas, and reserve positions was the primary mechanism by which the institution managed the human material it was using. A unit that had been in the front line was rotated back to a rest area where it was supposed to recover, train replacement personnel, and prepare for the next deployment forward. The rest areas were not actually restful in any simple sense. They were subject to artillery fire at ranges that made them dangerous. The training that occurred in them was rigorous. The accommodation was frequently poor, but they were away from the immediate front, and the absence of continuous proximity to death produced a recognizable change in men, a temporary relaxation of the state of continuous alertness that the front required, that was visible to observers, and that men described as one of the most reliable markers of the transition. The problem was that the rotation system did not consistently work as designed. Units were kept in the line longer than the prescribed rotation periods when operational requirements demanded it. Units that had taken heavy casualties were sent back to the front before they had had adequate time to replace and integrate new personnel. The system was continuously under pressure from the operational requirements of a war that consumed men faster than the system was designed to manage, and the response to that pressure was to compress the rest periods and extend the line periods, which produced a progressively more depleted human material, which produced less effective military performance, which produced higher casualties, which produced more pressure on the rotation system. The logic was circular, and the circle tightened over time. The experience of the men who survived the war and returned to civilian life encompasses perhaps the most disturbing and least officially acknowledged consequences of everything that has been described. These men returned to a world that had not been in the trenches, that had experienced the war from a distance, that had been shaped by the official and censored accounts of the war rather than by the actual experience of it. They returned with habits and responses that had been formed in conditions that no longer existed. They returned with the capacity for violence, for tolerance of extreme conditions, for the specific social dynamics of small units under extreme stress that had no application or outlet in peacetime. Some of them adjusted, some adjusted partially, maintaining the surface of civilian life while carrying the interior experience of the war in ways that were visible only to those closest to them. Some did not adjust. The rates of suicide among veterans in the decades following the war, the rates of alcoholism, the rates of what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, the rates of social dysfunction and employment instability and domestic violence are not reliably quantified because the institutions that might have tracked them had no interest in doing so. The war was over. The men had come home. The institution was done with them. The ongoing consequences of what the institution had required of them were reclassified from military concerns to personal ones, and the men dealt with them, or did not deal with them, privately, with the resources that they had, which were in many cases entirely inadequate. The pension system that was supposed to compensate men for the damage the war had done to them was designed in ways that consistently minimized the institutional obligation. Physical injuries were compensable according to a schedule that assigned monetary values to lost limbs and lost senses. Psychiatric injuries were not compensable in the same way because they could not be as easily quantified, and because the dominant institutional position throughout most of the war and well into the post-war period was that psychiatric injuries were either temporary or were evidence of a pre-existing condition that the individual had brought to the war, rather than a condition the war had produced. The burden of proof was on the veteran. The resources for establishing that proof were minimal. The administrative apparatus for processing claims was slow, inadequate, and consistently biased toward denying or minimizing claims that were ambiguous. Men who had been shell-shocked and who were now unable to work, unable to sleep, unable to maintain relationships, unable to function in ways that would have been ordinary before the war, navigated this apparatus with the resources of men who had been damaged by the very experience the apparatus was designed to compensate. The outcome of this navigation was frequently inadequate pension awards, delayed decisions, and the gradual attrition of men who simply stopped pursuing claims they were unable to prove to a standard the institution was unwilling to lower. The memorialization of the war, which began during the war itself and accelerated after it, produced a public narrative that was systematically different from the private narrative of the men who had fought it. The war memorials that appeared in every town and village in Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and elsewhere were built to honor the dead in language that was dignified and general. They honored sacrifice. They honored service. They honored the nation. They did not honor specific experience. They did not record what it had been like to stand in a flooded trench for 3 days without sleep, while the man next to you was killed by a sniper who had been waiting patiently for a moment of carelessness. They did not record the smell. They did not record the rats. They did not record the men who had been shot by their own side, or the men who had been destroyed psychologically and then returned to the line and then destroyed again, or the men who had come home and found that the world they had fought for was not a world they could live in. The official narrative required the sacrifice to have been meaningful, and meaningfulness required a certain shape of story, and the shape of story that was required was incompatible with the full truth of what had happened. The men who had been there knew this. Many of them accepted it, either because they agreed that some version of meaning was necessary, or because they had no energy to argue with a narrative that the entire society needed to believe. Some of them did not accept it. Some of them wrote their accounts. Some of them gave their testimonies. Some of them refused the pieties of the official narrative until the end of their lives. But the official narrative was more powerful than any individual testimony because it had the backing of institutions, of governments, of the entire apparatus of public commemoration, and because it served the psychological needs of a society that had suffered enormously and needed to believe that the suffering had been worth something. The industrial systems that manufactured the war's material, the shells, the guns, the gas, the barbed wire, the uniforms, the boots, the shovels, the mess tins, the identification discs, the rubber stamps that processed the casualty notifications, operated at scales and with efficiencies that the men at the front experienced as a kind of totality. The war was everywhere. It was in every material object of their daily existence. It was in every system they moved through, and the scale of that totality made it resistant to the kind of individual resistance or refusal that might have been possible in a smaller, less systematized conflict. The war was too large to walk away from. It was too thoroughly embedded in the social and institutional fabric of the societies, conducting it to be comprehensively refused. Men who refused it, who deserted, who went missing, who refused orders, faced consequences ranging from the disciplinary to the lethal, and the men around them faced consequences too, because units that demonstrated insufficient offensive spirit were noted and punished collectively, and men who wanted to protect their comrades had reasons of loyalty that supplemented the reasons of fear in keeping them functional within the system. The system was good at generating reasons. It was good at making compliance seem like the only rational choice. It was good at making the ongoing participation in something monstrous seem like the natural, necessary, and indeed moral response to the conditions it had created. The war produced its own justifications from within its own logic, and the logic was tight enough that most men inside it never found a gap wide enough to step through. By the time the armistice was signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, approximately 17 million people were dead. The number, stated plainly, is large enough to lose its meaning immediately, which is perhaps the most honest description of what large numbers of dead mean to the people who are not among them. The men in the trenches who heard the ceasefire that morning described the silence that followed as one of the strangest sounds they had ever heard, because they had been living in the constant sound of artillery for so long that silence had become alien. a condition that required adjustment, a new abnormality to replace the old one. Some men wept. Some sat very still. Some began walking in directions that they had not been able to walk in for years. Some described feeling nothing at all, which was perhaps the most accurate emotional response to the end of something that had begun as an emergency and become, through its sheer duration and totality, the entire content of existence. The war did not end cleanly. The systems it had built, the habits it had formed, the damage it had done, continued past the ceasefire. The men went home over weeks and months in a demobilization process that was chronically disorganized. The pension tribunals began their work. The hospitals continued to receive patients. The graves registration units continued to look for the dead. The casualty lists continued to be processed. The letters informing families of deaths that had occurred weeks or months before continued to arrive at addresses where people had been waiting. The war produced consequences that outlasted the war by years and decades. The men who had been inside it carried it with them until they died, and some of them died with it still entirely unresolved, carrying something that had no name in the language available to them, and that the world they returned to had neither the vocabulary nor the institutional willingness to acknowledge. The categories used to count the dead were never fully reconciled. Different nations used different counting methods. Different services within the same nation used different methods. The distinction between killed in action, died of wounds, and died of other causes produced different numbers depending on who was counting and when. The distinction between military dead and civilian dead was sometimes clear and sometimes not. The calculations of men who had been disabled by the war, permanently removed from productive life by injury or illness or psychological damage, were not consistently included in assessments of the war's cost. The numbers that appear in histories are estimates, and the estimates vary considerably depending on the methodology and the sources. The uncertainty is not a minor statistical matter. It is a statement about the nature of the war's relationship to the people inside it. The institution that conducted the war was not, in the end, fully able to account for what it had done. It had records of expenditure, of ammunition, of rations, of transport, of communication, of territory gained and lost. It had less complete records of the human beings it had used to produce those outcomes. The gap between the precision of the logistical records and the imprecision of the human ones is not accidental. It reflects a hierarchy of institutional attention that had been present from the beginning and that did not change when the war ended.